has been someone who has been on the ground and has actually conducted empirical research and has actually come up with findings, it can, to some extent, beat theory. Because you just need to weigh the two. Sometimes you just need to marry the theory to practice. And if the person has been on the ground, and I think that we could, for practical purposes, we should actually uphold the views of the person who has just conducted empirical view rather than somebody who has merely theorized about you. So I think we should just know how to massage the situation.
Can I just respond there? You're missing my point entirely. It was not about which type of methodology is much more superior or we should be very much more on. It's about the manner in which the debate was conducted. It's about engaging. It's not about making sweeping statements about somebody and saying that somebody does not know anything about something.
Okay.
You know. So it's, I'm not, and I was actually quite persuaded by his contribution, and actually agree. So it wasn't about the contributions per se. It was the manner in which it was said and the sweeping statements.
Okay.
And with our history in this country, so many scholars being simply dismissed without engaging with their scholarship.
Okay.
That has been a pattern.
Okay.
That we need to be departing from. So it was
fair enough. I wrote a review of Citizen and Subject years ago. I'm sure you could probably find it. And I do engage with it very thoroughly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Anne?
Okay. All right. I think that some questions have been treated here in some detail, so I'll confine myself to two. I think that the whole question of playing the different forms of law, K.D. Matanzima is an expert at this. He was a trained lawyer, a graduate of Fort Hare. He was also a Tembu chief by a minor house, and he wanted to assert his authority above that of the Great House. So he invented the history of the right-hand house as a parallel system to the Great House, borrowing on the writing of people like Teosego, who argued that in the context of colonial divisions, the right-hand house had moved further westward, was separated from the great houses that were east, and therefore could rise up and contest them. That this was in fact very similar to the old forms of fission, but in fact this view has been contested by writers who argue that the Tembu and the Xhosa didn't break up or expand through fission but through segmentation, and that they continued and needed to continue to owe allegiance to the Great House. Now, Matanzima played with that. He played with it for over a decade until he got himself a paramountcy and then became president of the Transkei. So he's an expert at playing these different forms of legality, if you like, in these different systems, because he straddled both and his ambitions were channeled through both, okay? So that's in answer to your question. Others, far less sophisticated, bungle and fumble with this, but that doesn't mean they don't try, okay? So he's an example who got further, and still his family, the Nomtraba and others, are still crying that the Nhlapa Commission knocked them down a notch in terms of this traditional hierarchy, and they are still crying that this is in fact a legitimate claim, and they continue to advance that argument. Okay, so that's on the question of genealogy and law. Then the other question I wanted to respond to was the question on civil society and reform. What is the role of civil society? Now, civil society in the rural areas has not been particularly strong. In the rural areas that I know, in the Eastern Cape, where I've been researching for the last while. The opposition to the chiefs in the Bantustan area was often read by academics, and I hate to say this particularly by white academics, as anti-apartheid, as pro-democracy, as pro-revolution. It was very often tied up with conflicts about the headman and which faction wanted which person as headman. It was very tied up. It was never separate. Yes, it did have an influence from urban migrants who'd come home. They very often had a committee in the hostels where they were located, and then went to go and fight for their particular chosen leader on that side. So always the politics of liberation, the politics of anti-certain leaders was mixed up, if you like. It was never purely democratic or purely ethnic. This purity doesn't exist as far as I can see it. It is, people don't live in pure divisions. They live in complex interrelationships of these ideas. So, to come back to the question of civil society. Civil society was then mixed up with this. I mean, if you think of Chununga, he was the ANC secretary of the Western Cape. He was in the treason trial. He became Matanzima's secretary. After the end of the Bantustan regime, he was very close to Mandela and not officially employed because he was now retired, but he did a great deal of work in that area. So things are messy, things are complex. What one has seen, political parties, I don't know if they're even political parties, people wearing red t-shirts, okay? They will get into the politics of community councils and try to capture the community council. That ends up just being divisive. It ends up simply creating further divisions in the community, further hostility. We've seen it, and my colleague Luvuyo Watchela has written this extraordinary book on capricious patronage and captive land on Zweledinga in the Chris Hani district, where he tracks the removals of people from Herschel and Glen Grey in the 1970s and 80s, and their resettlement on that land. And the attempts of the civil society, the Border Rural Committee and others supported by the Legal Resources Centre and so on, who tried to get in there and sort things out. But they too got pulled into one or other faction. Rural politics is very messy. It's very hard for civil society to carve out some kind of political path that is of higher value, that is of more noble ambition and goals. My sense is that the most successful interventions have been around very specific concrete things. For example, if there are water points and everybody needs to get to them, then working with the community to get unity, to get a common system of how to utilize that resource has got much further and being more useful as of a civil society invention. So civil society can cut through some of these divisions and these tensions, but it usually lasts better when it's tied to a resource rather than tied to a politics that is out there in some kind of amorphous way. I want to also just say that the chieftaincy is very much scrambled by conquest and by apartheid Volkerkunde experts, anthropologists trained in Afrikaans-speaking universities in an Afrikaner-influenced, German-influenced approach called Volkerkunde, where they had to create ethnicities that served the Afrikaans folk, not that served the ethnicity they've created. So this is a complicated thing. They had to create ethnicities that fit into the apartheid model. And people utilized this opportunity. It was an avenue on which you could go for resources, that you could find ascendancy. And that practice is still there. There are opportunists all over trying this out, trying to say, we've got a genealogy. And then they would have sent the Volkerkunde expert in. And the reports in the archives are magic reading. They say, this doesn't really make sense. There's no historical evidence for it, but it suits our purpose. And so what they're going to decide is like reading the bones, you know. There's no superior anything in this politics. That politics, since 1948, since 1951, since the Bantu Authorities Act, has scrambled a great deal of what goes on in these rural areas. So one is unscrambling that also. So it's not clean and tidy, it's not neat and pure, but at the same time you've got real people living in these environments living with this complexity. And, you know, there is no simple way out of this. You know, you cannot simply abolish the past or the traces that it has left in the present. You know, that for me is our challenge. How do you work with that?
On that note, please join me in thanking the panelists. What I take away from this panel is that it's a mess. And I also want to remind us that our own attempts post-apartheid to sort out the mess have made things worse. Think of the Nhlapo Commission. But that's a conversation to continue another day. Thank you very much. Let's take tea for the next 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
I'm always struck by how people manage to the resilience
Sorry?
of rural areas is extraordinary.
It is incredible.
And one has
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
show
No,
resilience.
that's true.
I like the point you make about politics is not really the way in which we can mobilize.
So I'm going to stay at the table, and this is like a bit of a dark corner. Let me try and get to that side.
Thank you. Can we figure out an order in which to go?
I definitely wanted to go after Carl. Just makes more
Okay.
sense.
So, okay, sorry, I was not meant to chair this panel, so I'm not quite entirely
You're last.
the last.
Okay, so
Okay, so Carl will start with you, and then we'll come to Patrick and. Three, yeah. Sorry, I was not meant to be here. As I told you earlier,
I will chair
yeah. So we're going to start with Carl. He's going to, so that we can start.
do we need these?
Yeah, for the camera, live streaming. Use a different system, I think.
So this is live screening, eh? I thought I was in like an influential little back room here. Let me put this down. Okay. Hang on a sec.
Thank you for joining us again. We were talking politics, public administration, and citizen mobilization with three panelists. First, just start with a disclaimer. My name is not Christopher Mulder. I'm now chairing this panel instead of Christine Mulder. And three panelists in the order in which they're going to speak. Carl van Holt, who is with the Society Work and Development Institute at WITS. Patrick Heller, who is Lynn Cross Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Brown University. And Pindi Lekis-Yuana, who's a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. So without further ado, Carl, thank you.
Right. Thanks. Okay, so I've got about 20 minutes, right? 15. Oh, maybe, you know. Okay, so you won't get the last parts. That's fine. You won't get the conclusions. Hard bargaining. So I'm going to talk actually about the politics of corruption. And I think the paper that I've written engages with a number of different texts, but one of I think probably what the key one is, the one that I'm engaging with this afternoon, is mostly the Promise Betrayed, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which I think did a fantastic kind of first cut investigation, or at least synthesis of the material that was known at the time about what's called corruption in South Africa. And I'm in a kind of an argument with that text this afternoon. So there's 4 points that I want to make. The first is that elite formation or class formation is probably the defining feature of South African politics, South African society, post-apartheid. The second point is that there's a very pervasive system of informal system of rent capture, patronage, factionism, and violence. And the Zupta project is only one project within a much wider system. Was, maybe. The third point, which I'll leave kind of as a teaser right now, is that the Zuma project gave corruption a bad name. Right. And the fourth, well, I've just labeled, well, the fourth is a set of questions relating to the Ramaphosa project and what its prospects might be and what the challenges are that face it. So I think that, the politics of corruption, why I talk about the politics of corruption. I think in relation to that, my argument is that any attempt to address what is currently described as corruption has to engage with the politics that underpins and surrounds it. And my sense is that a lot of the work a lot of the kind of the positions, the perspectives that prevail in the public domain don't do that. They tend to see it as a kind of very specific project organized around Zuma and the Guptas, and one that if they are removed and if their networks are removed, we can go back to normal. And my argument is the opposite, actually. So, elite formation, class formation. So, what I'm going to be looking at is the formation. So I call it elite formation because there's a number of different classes being formed within a broader process of elite formation, one of them being a business class or capitalist class. And just in brackets, it's important to note in principle that at the same time as this kind of class formation is taking place upwards, and it's characterized by social mobility, upward mobility, there's a simultaneous, at the bottom end, below, there's a simultaneous fragmentation of the working class and formation of an expanded class of the poor. But I'm not really going to go there today. So why do I say that elite formation is the kind of driving force in the new South Africa? Well, the historical problem posed by apartheid is the suppression of class formation. Apartheid revolved around suppressing the formation of black elite classes. I don't really need to go into that. The consequence is that at the dawn of a new democracy, society is characterized by the market domination of, let's call it, white monopoly capital. Very difficult to enter into these markets that are dominated by very big corporates. A lack of capital available to would-be black business or middle classes, a 30% unemployment rate and a higher poverty rate, which means that even more so, there's very little access to capital or opportunities for business. And then there's the property clause of the Constitution. So it's quite clear that in those circumstances, an aspirant, particularly let's say an aspirant, wealthy, wealth-seeking elite, and particularly a business class, would turn to the state. The state's a very big resource, a lot of revenue, a lot of capital, a lot of assets, control of a lot of resources that are kind of central to business, or possibilities for business anyway, for rent seeking. Now, that's the first point, this elite formation. And I have to say that, if you look closely at it, it extends right through society, not least, for example, the trade unions, which normally you would think are not really part of elite formation, but they are sites of class formation and sites of what is called corruption. So to move to the second point, to the kind of system underpinning and surrounding this, so I argue that this process has given rise to an extensive informal political system of rent capture, patronage, factionalism, and violence. Those are the kind of qualities that emerge in this informal system. Why informal? Well, the formal political system, for the reasons that I've outlined already, doesn't really provide space for this kind of formation, for the emergence of a new entrepreneurial class and a new wealthy elite. Some of the qualities of this informal system are that it is pervasive, dispersed, and uncoordinated. So when I say system, I'm not talking about something that's got a kind of commander-in-chief somewhere who's sending out instructions. No. It's a set of understandings, a set of practices, a set of ways of doing things that has got multiple centers. Now, why do I call it a system then? Well, let me put it this way. If you become an MEC or a councillor, no matter what your own personal perspective on this system is, on the way it works, when you go into that institution, you're going to find that that system comes knocking at your door. And that it's very difficult to resist the kinds of offers and the kinds of requests that are made. This is not a question of personal morality, by and large. It's a question of how the system works. And if you want to resist the system, you're likely to find yourself out of a job as a councillor or MEC. So it's pervasive, dispersed, and uncoordinated. It's entangled with the formal political system. So it weaves its way in and through the formal political system, the formal constitutional democracy that we've got. It's found at every level, local government. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on research on protests there, and we find that the system that I'm describing is really pervasive at local government level, at provincial government level, as well as at national government level, and in organizations like trade unions. So what we call corruption, and corruption formally defined, is illicit activity in which an individual or a group of individuals, a network of individuals, makes use of state resources to feather their own nests. So corruption is one element in the system. Others are, for example, BEE, land redistribution in some ways. And very important, and I think this was being discussed, well, I don't know if it was being discussed in the earlier session, but it's related to the discussion of traditional authorities. And that is the dispossession of rural villages by a kind of alliance of chiefs, mining corporations, and the state. A massive dispossession. And when the state talks, when government talks about changing policy around land redistribution and expropriating white land, there's an uproar in the press. But this kind of dispossession, when villages are dispossessed of their own land and can't get access to land to farm on, to work on, or even unpoisoned water and so on, it's barely discussed. It's kind of invisible. So within these multiple sites for rent capture and class formation, the ZIPTA project is simply one project, albeit a massive project. Now, conceptually, and I don't have time to go into this, I just want to flag it, I think, is that I want to use Karl Polanyi, well-known theorist of what he called marketization, and what's often called neoliberalism now, to argue that this system, this informal system, constitutes a form of struggle against marketization and the disembedding of accumulation by globalized capitalism. In other words, the kind of removal of the dynamics of accumulation from any kind of national territory and their existence elsewhere in the form of multinationals, in the form of financial institutions, and so on. A way in which accumulation is taken beyond national efforts to control it. And in some ways, that's what this kind of informal system is fighting against, in some ways. And a struggle to re-embed accumulation locally, to allow for the formation of a local black business class. So then point number 3, the Zuma project gave corruption a bad name. So, well, actually, before I go there, if I can, because I think I've used 10 minutes, which means I'm halfway, which means I can just about do it. I want to read a quote from an interview with a national office bearer in a trade union that I conducted in 2012. So, I mean, this is just to give a sense when I say that this system predates Zuma and is much more extensive. So what he says to me is, it's about the kind of lifestyle they live, the cars they drive, and including what we drink when we are socializing. When you ask, but comrades, why are you doing things like this, referring to corruption, they say, you live in the past. And when it comes to tenders, the first thing they want to know is how much they are going to get from the tender. When you ask them, how can you do such a thing? They ask you, what's wrong with you? This is how things are done. They really laugh their lungs out when you ask them about these things. And he goes on about some of this, and then he says, so our cadres look for one of us who seems to be doing better, and they follow on their footsteps. And those become dominant values, which overshadow the old values. The younger ones have been communicated this message, that this is the way of doing things. So you don't want to be good at school. You don't need to be good at school. You don't need to work hard. You can find shortcuts. You've got to be connected. There are just too many people who are trapped in corruption now. You cannot, this is 2012, you cannot deal comprehensively with it because the problem is at the top. People know this will collapse the ANC or the state if it is dealt with in a serious way. I'm afraid, comrade, I'm very afraid. I think it gives you a sense of how this has become a set of practices that is part of a normality. So the Zuma project, so what are its distinctive features? So, I mean, as is well known, it arose firstly as a populist response to Mbeki's project. So Mbeki's project emphasized global capitalism and disembedded accumulation, with a relatively narrow base among aspirant business, mostly in the BEE sectors, but that's a very small sector. And so under Zuma, there was so Zuma mobilized on a kind of populist platform, mobilizing both elites who felt excluded, but also people, trade unionists, rural people, who felt also excluded by Mbeki's kind of modernist project. But quite rapidly, there was a shift within the Zuma administration to focus on elite accumulation and an abandonment of the broader populist project. Hence the break with the Youth League and with Malema in particular, and then the emergence of the EFF. Over time, the project, pursuing its own logic, over time the Zuma project ballooned into one that I think can be characterized as large-scale looting. And I mean, this is a question actually, because I think certainly personally, I feel the need for more research here, is whether this project was narrow-based or broad-based. So if you read The Promise Betrayed, the betrayal of the promise, it looks like a very narrow base. There's a very small cohort of people who are named there or alluded to there as being part of the network. But I want to argue that that part of the Zupta project was an extended licensing of his allies across the state to engage in similar practices without any necessary connection to Zuma or to the Guptas, apart from the odd gift, of, I don't know, 2 million rands worth of cattle or whatever for Zuma's farm. But other than that, kind of relatively autonomous systems of looting. And this was particularly strong in KZN, Free State, and Northwest. Now, some other elements here, which are a slightly separate list because these were weaknesses within the project. Firstly, it led to a loss of electoral support. I think as more and more of this got out, there was an increasing loss of electoral support. I don't think only because of corruption, but partly because of it. And so there's this question about the core project, the Zupta core project, the narrowness of its base. It seems to me that perhaps it did have a narrow base. And there was also the contradictory role of the Guptas. If this project is about, in a sense, nationalizing accumulation, bringing it home, forming a new indigenous business class, or creating opportunities for them. How much more time have we got?
You've got, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
The Guptas are an anomaly in the system. They're not South African, they're not black South African, they're Indian, they're from elsewhere. And this is, in a sense, a kind of it's an offshoring. There's a lot of offshoring that takes place through them. And I think that this led to tensions with the Zuma project. And finally, as the project kind of span out of control, it led to sort of very visible institutional destruction, budget collapse, I mean, the nuclear deal was the kind of epitomized that, but it's coming. I mean, it came with the SOEs, the enormous loss to the state, and with SARS. And so it became no longer tenable. And these constituted political weaknesses and then a resistance mobilized by Gordon. So that's the third point. So the Ramaphosa project, what does that consist of? So in my own experience, in my own view, as an individual, he's intensely anti-corruption. And he's also committed to negotiated pacts, which distinguishes him from Thabo Mbeki. Nonetheless, he's inclined towards similar strategies of disembedded accumulation as Mbeki, but willing to compromise, for example, on radical land redistribution. But, so that's the man as an individual, the president as an individual. But he's already encircled by agents of the informal political system that I described, both in the top 6 and in provincial allies, Eastern Cape allies, Mpumalanga allies. It's not clear that he has an anti-corruption mandate from the ANC and from the National Conference. There's a kind of assumption in the press, in the media, in the public domain that he's got a mandate from the conference to act against corruption. It's not at all clear that that is the case. He will have to, so his project means is quite tenuous at the moment. He will have to build a coalition which will have to include agents of the same informal political system. In other words, you'll have to include the corrupt in the coalition. And you'll have to make concessions to them. So the big questions are whether he can build a stable enough coalition to last over time. That's absolutely critical for any progress on at least regenerating some state institutions. A coalition that simultaneously allows him to moderate rent-seeking, i.e. corruption. In other words, not allow the institutional destruction that we saw under the Zupta project. This would allow him, or allow the leadership, to rebuild core institutions, and of course for the civil society organizations that want to assist with that to get some traction. And possibly, is it possible for him at the same time to establish some kind of developmental trajectory that is not just about disembedded accumulation? Now, I mean, the evidence, the kind of material that I've been looking at internationally about this kind of coalition forming and so on, North Wallace and Waingast in particular, suggests that in order to build a stable coalition that can last over time, there will have to be a high degree of force, actually, available to the leadership in order to police such a coalition. In other words, it requires something akin to a quote-unquote strong man. I don't see anyone on the horizon at the moment in the Ramaphosa coalition. He's a man who depends on negotiations, not on force, not on enforcement. Where is that strong man? And I say that with I mean, it always, virtually always is a man. And of course, I say that with some kind of circumspection because a strong man leads to a whole lot of other things, including a repression of civil society. But I have to say that, on an analysis of the forces available, in terms of this analysis, the prospects do not look particularly good. Thanks.
Thank you. Patrick.
So I'll move away from the screen.
Thank you, Mbukiseni. Thanks for organizing this conference, to you and your incredible team at PARI. It's a real privilege and an honor to be here. And thank you for making this comparative so I could come to South Africa again. It's wonderful to be back. I'm going to get to state capture, but I want to begin by arguing that if we're going to think about reform, especially in the three cases I'm interested in South Africa, India, and Brazil, we have to think first and foremost about democratic deepening. These are just 3 quotes from 3 sort of well-known political scientists and a sociologist. Scott Paul, democracy grew up historically out of century-long struggles among social groups between state authorities and their subjects. And I'd add, even once democracy is consolidated, this is an ongoing dynamic. Democracy is a never-ending process. The right to associate, this is Jonathan Fox, who's done a lot of work on clientelism and semi-clientelism in Mexico. The right to associational autonomy, which I think is really the key category for thinking about the actual practices of democracy. That is the ability of individuals, but also autonomous civil society organizations to associate, to mobilize, to contest, to engage without compromising their autonomy. That's really, I want to argue, the key to democracy. That associational autonomy is constructed gradually and unevenly through cycles of conflict that leave nascent democratic forces with political resources to draw on in successive rounds. And then finally, and the Latin Americanists all know O'Donnell, Argentinian, right? Yeah, I don't want to get into trouble. A terrific comparative Argentinian political theorist. And he's great because he's got this whole sense of degrees of democracy within a single national territory, which is really important for what I have to say. And he argues that if political democracy is to be consolidated, or if you will, deepened, and using framing of this, democratic practice needs to be spread throughout society, creating a rich fabric of democratic institutions and authorities. And I'll come back to each of these quotes. So I want to begin with just a few quick comments about the key category of interest today. And I want to begin by first saying that you're not alone. I want to reassure you that state capture is not a particularly South African problem. I work a lot on India, and the degree of state capture makes state capture in South Africa look like an episode of Sesame Street. I mean, the Indian state, Modi just sold the contract to build 197 fighter planes to the Ambanis. And the problem with that is the Ambanis are great industrialists and have never built airplanes in their lives, right? But they've, of course, supported the Modi government through their media interests, their oil interests, et cetera, et cetera. So state capture in India is quite pervasive. And, we're on the verge of a deep democratic crisis in Brazil, which is one of the sort of shining, bright stories of democratic deepening, which I'll be talking about in a moment. And that crisis itself has been precipitated by a form of state capture that looks a lot like the South African story. I mean, the PT, the Workers' Party, in power for a long time, just like the ANC, maybe was a little too anxious to stay in power and exploited public resources in the form of Petrobras to essentially build a cabal and build political support. And, got exposed by a quite independent judiciary, and now there's a complete political crisis, right? Which might end up with Brazil out-trumping Trump, which is a really scary thought. So having said that, clearly there may be some global phenomenon going on here because, if Trump isn't an example of state capture, then I don't know what is, and that's supposed to be one of the oldest, most institutionalized democracies with deep checks and balances, and yet we have a well-known launderer of global capital in the White House, using his position in the White House to support foreign policies that support his business interests, right? And it doesn't get any cruder than that. Having said that, I think we want to be really careful in using the term state capture and recognize that we've got to disaggregate the state. And people have been saying disaggregate for a long time. And what's funny is that no one ever actually does it. The unit of analysis is always the state, the capital state, the national state. And the problem is that even as there are sectors of the state that get captured, SARS and the state enterprises in South Africa, there's other sectors that do really well. And I think we need to remember that in the South African case in particular, the state throughout this period has been quite good at redistribution. There's some good data that suggests that post-income redistribution through child support, through the old age pension scheme in South Africa, is about the highest level of post-income distribution in middle-income countries. And it's really well targeted, it's really efficient, and it has clear poverty reduction effects. So you know, we've got capture and then we've got quasi-Weberian efficiency side by side, and we need to disaggregate these things. Just a quick word about what I call presentism or front pageism. Looking at Brazil today, it's easy to come to the conclusion that democracy is in complete crisis, and we should at least wait till Sunday's election. But it looks like it's not going in a very optimistic direction anymore. Having said that, the last 30 years, as some of the presentations on Latin America this morning have shown, have been 3 decades of quite significant state-led transformation and social development and institution building throughout Latin America, and especially in Brazil. And despite the current crisis, we shouldn't lose sight of that. And then finally, just a quick word on the resiliency of civil society. It's manifest here in this room, but part of the downfall of Zuma was a function of the fact that despite state capture, despite even some episodes of repression and mobilization of violence and intimidation, civil society in South Africa remained quite resilient and played a quite a central role in bringing about Zuma's downfall. So in talking about democratic deepening, I'm going to give you just these sort of big sort of theoretical frames, but then move directly to what I'm most interested in, which is local government, which I think often gets lost in some of these discussions about national state institutions. And here, I want to make the point that democratic deepening is extraordinarily challenging. It's difficult. And it really has to happen along 2 related but analytically distinct axes. So one is the sort of Weberian stuff about, stateness. This is what O'Donnell talks about. It's about the spread of legality, the spread of, in Latin America, I keep hearing the term institutionality, which I love because it's not even really English, but we all get what it means. And it's the idea that you build robust, rule-bound, constitutionally embedded, Weberian-like institutions, and we all know what those look like. That's the good governance stuff. But building it's actually quite challenging, and we need to remember that you have to build it at multiple scales, especially, India is 1.2 billion people, Brazil is enormous, South Africa is diverse and federalized. So it's not just about building national institutions, it's about building local government, and that is a huge challenge in and of itself. And authorizing democracy at the local level. And we take this for granted, and we shouldn't, because local government in India is not democratic, as I'll show you in a moment. And one of the key things to do, one of the key objectives here, again in this kind of O'Donnell sense of spreading democratic practices, is expanding what I call the surface area of the democratic state. To practice citizenship, you have to be able to find the damn state. And it's actually hard for a lot of people to find the state. And when they do find the state, it's not the state they're really looking for. It's the police or, just being able to use the state and use it by deploying your rights is challenging, in part because of the institutional weakness of many post-colonial states. Stateness, in turn, is a precondition for, but can also be reinforced by participation. And what O'Donnell called high-intensity citizenship. And this is a take on, Rousseau being French had to say mean things about the English, and most famously said the British are free 1 day every 4 years, and then they live in tyranny. And when we talk about democracy, we generally mean representative democracy. Representative democracy is a really blunt and not very good mechanism of accountability. Right? We elect someone, we send them off to a faraway capital, and 4 years later, supposedly we have enough information to make an informed decision about whether or not, we need continuous accountability, and that's of course the role of civil society, and it's key to supporting effective citizenship, so people having a sense of rights, having good information, having spaces in which they can actually operate as citizens. But at a broader level, what's key, I think, to supporting participation in high-intensity citizenship is a balance between political and civil society. And here, just very quickly, for me, political society, we all know political society is parties. Parties aggregate interests. If they're successful, they enter the state, where they then pursue interests which aren't always the interests that they represent because they have a stake in staying in power, so they can often instrumentalize power. That's certainly what the ANC has done. And the PT in its latter years has behaved increasingly more in terms of its own interests of staying in power than serving its constituencies. But that's the nature of complex organizations. Power flows to the top. It's called the iron law of oligarchy. It's well known. That has to be balanced out. And the key to balancing it out, I would argue, is a vibrant civil society and complementing the formal accountability that comes with elections and representation and constitutional rules with the